On a sunny morning in March 1961, Daniel Raymond Fletcher walked into the First National Bank of Coral Harbor, Florida, wearing an impeccable gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase. 42 minutes later, he walked out the back door with $85,000 in gold bars and rare coins. And then, he simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed the man and the treasure whole. For 27 years, the FBI, private detectives, and bounty hunters scoured every inch of the Florida coastline. For 27 years, the victims' families demanded answers, and for 27 years, the ocean kept a secret that would make any investigator's blood run cold in their veins. If you're fascinated by mysteries that defy all logical explanations, click subscribe now, because this is a story that will completely change what you think you know about impossible disappearances. And I guarantee that until the very last second of this video, you won't be able to stop watching. Because in 1988, an amateur diver doing a routine exploration at 120 feet of depth found something that police swore was impossible. And what he saw in the dark depths of the Atlantic not only solved the mystery of Daniel Fletcher's disappearance, but opened a Pandora's box of even more disturbing questions. To understand how a man can simply evaporate with a fortune in gold, we first need to know who Daniel Raymond Fletcher was. And I need to warn you, nothing in this man's life suggested that he would be capable of executing one of the most audacious robberies in Florida history. Daniel was born on the 15th of April, 1923, on a small farm on the outskirts of Tallahassee. He was the oldest of 5 siblings, son of Frank and Dorothy Fletcher, a family of Methodist farmers who believed in hard work and honesty above all else. Neighbors remembered Daniel as a quiet boy, almost shy, who preferred to spend hours fixing old engines in the barn rather than playing with other children. At 18 years old, in 1941, Daniel enlisted in the United States Navy. He served in the Pacific throughout World War II, mainly as a naval mechanic aboard the USS Saratoga. He was known among his crewmates as Fletcher the Silent One, a man who rarely smiled, but who could fix any engine no matter how damaged it was. His commanding officer wrote in an evaluation from 1944, "Fletcher possesses exceptional technical intelligence and a calm under pressure that borders on the supernatural." That calm would be crucial years later. Daniel returned to Florida in 1946, after the war, a transformed man. Not in the traumatic sense that affected so many veterans, but in a more subtle way. Childhood friends said he seemed calculated, more observant, as if he were always measuring distances, calculating angles, planning escape routes even in casual conversations at the supermarket. In 1948, at 25 years old, Daniel married Margaret Ann Dawson, an elementary school teacher with red hair and green eyes whom he met at a church party. Margaret, according to all accounts, was Daniel's opposite: outgoing, warm, always laughing. Neighbors in Coral Harbor, where the couple settled, said that Margaret humanized Daniel, that she could coax genuine smiles from that usually expressionless face. They had 2 daughters, Sarah, born in 1949, and Rebecca, in 1952. Daniel worked as a specialized mechanic on marine engines at Coastal Marine Services, a shipyard 3 kilometers from his home. It was honest work that paid well enough to keep the family comfortable. They had a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, a blue 1957 Ford, and every Sunday afternoon, Daniel would take the girls fishing on the pier. Physically, Daniel stood 1 meter and 78 centimeters, tall, with a lean but muscular build from years of physical labor. Dark brown hair beginning to show gray threads at the temples. Blue-gray eyes that, according to Margaret, never stopped thinking, and a small crescent-shaped scar on his left eyebrow, the result of an accident during the war. But there was something about Daniel Fletcher that not even Margaret fully understood. He had a peculiar obsession with nautical maps and ocean currents. The small office in his home was lined with navigation charts, tide tables, studies on wind patterns, and in the last 2 years before the robbery, Daniel began disappearing occasionally on Saturday mornings, saying he was going fishing alone. Margaret never questioned it. She had no idea that Daniel was taking private diving courses with a retired Navy instructor in Fort Pierce, paying in cash, using a false name. None of his co-workers suspected anything irregular. George Hartman, who worked side by side with Daniel for 8 years, later described him to investigators as the most predictable guy in the world. Daniel arrived at work at 7 in the morning sharp, every single day. He brought his lunch in a metal lunchbox. He rarely missed work. He never complained. He did his job with meticulous precision and went home at 5:15. But what George and the others didn't know was that twice a week during lunch hour, Daniel didn't eat his sandwich in the cafeteria. Instead, he would go to the First National Bank of Coral Harbor, not to conduct transactions, just to observe, to count the steps between the main door and the vault, to time the security guards' rounds, to memorize the employees' faces and their break schedules. For 3 years and 7 months, Daniel Fletcher studied that bank the way a scientist studies an organism under a microscope. And no one, absolutely no one, noticed. Friday, the 17th of March, 1961. The day began like any other in Coral Harbor, a coastal town of 14,000 inhabitants where everyone knew everyone, and where the most serious crime of the past year had been a teenager stealing beer from Thompson's grocery store. The sky was partly cloudy. The temperature read 23 degrees Celsius at 7 in the morning. A light breeze was blowing from the southeast at 15 kilometers per hour. Daniel Fletcher had mentally noted all these details before even leaving his house. Margaret remembered that morning perfectly. She was frying eggs in the kitchen when Daniel came down the stairs at 6:45, wearing that gray suit she had never seen before. "You look handsome," she said, surprised. Daniel rarely wore a suit, except for weddings and funerals. He smiled, that small, controlled smile, and said, "Important meeting at the bank today. About a loan for new equipment at work." It was such a natural lie that Margaret didn't question it for a second. Daniel kissed his wife, stroked the hair of Sarah, who was 12 years old, and Rebecca, who was 9, while they ate cereal at the table, and walked out the door at 7:05. He didn't take the Ford. Instead, he walked 3 blocks to a rented garage that Margaret didn't know existed, where a green 1959 Chevrolet pickup truck was parked, registered under the false name of Robert Mills. At 7:32, Daniel parked the pickup truck at exactly 240 meters from the side entrance of the First National Bank. Peter, waited. Wristwatch synchronized. Heart beating in steady rhythm. No visible nervousness. The First National Bank of Coral Harbor was a 2-story building in Art Deco style, built in 1938. It had 3 doors: the main entrance on 3rd Avenue, a side door on Elm Street, and an emergency exit in the back that led to an alley. Daniel knew that the back door was rarely locked during business hours, relying only on a silent alarm connected to the local police station, 3 blocks away. At 8:54 in the morning, 6 minutes before official opening, Daniel entered through the main door. Inside the leather briefcase, he carried a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson loaded with 6 bullets, 3 rolls of industrial adhesive tape, nylon rope, and a hand-drawn map with such precision that it seemed the work of a professional cartographer. There were only 4 employees inside the bank at that moment. The manager, Harold Patterson, 58 years old, was unlocking the main vault. The head teller, Dorothy Simmons, 32 years old, was organizing her station. The security guard, James Worthy, 61 years old, a retired former police officer, was making his first round of the day. And the junior secretary, Linda Hayes, 23 years old, was preparing coffee in the back room. Daniel left the bank at 9:36 in the morning. 42 minutes. Not 1 second more than he had planned. What happened in those 42 minutes would be reconstructed later through the traumatized testimonies of the victims. Daniel moved through the bank like a ghost, every step rehearsed, every movement economical. He never shouted, never directly threatened. He simply showed the weapon, spoke in a low, calm voice, and instructed each person exactly what to do. Dorothy Simmons would remember later. His eyes. They were like looking at the ocean on a moonless night. Empty. There was no anger. There was no emotion. It was more frightening than if he had been screaming. Daniel tied up each employee with professional precision, cutting off circulation enough to prevent movement, but not enough to cause permanent injury. A skill learned in the Navy. He cut the telephone lines. He disabled the audible alarm system with a special tool that he himself had manufactured. And then he went to the vault. The First National Bank was keeping, that specific morning, a special deposit that Daniel knew would be there. A private collector from Miami was transferring part of his collection of rare coins and gold bars to an auction in New York. The shipment had arrived at the bank on Thursday afternoon and would be transferred on Monday. $240,000 in 1961 value, mainly in physical gold. Daniel took $85,000 in gold bars and rare coins. 5 small bars, each weighing approximately 5 kilograms, and several dozens of rare gold coins. Total weight, about 27 kilograms. He left the rest because he knew exactly how much weight he could carry and still move quickly, and more importantly, how much he could transport alone in a small boat and then dive with it. At 9:36, he exited through the back door, carrying 2 canvas bags on his shoulders. Not running, walking with purpose. The silent alarm had been triggered when he forced the vault, but Daniel had timed this too. He had exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds before patrol. Cars would arrive. Witnesses on Elm Street saw a man in a gray suit walking calmly toward a green pickup truck. He looked like a businessman going to a meeting, Henry Moss, who was sweeping the sidewalk of his barber shop, would say later. Daniel drove exactly within the speed limit to the port of Coral Harbor. 3 miles, 6 minutes. At 9:43, he parked the pickup truck at Pier 7, a less busy section of the port where private fishing boats were anchored. And then, Daniel Fletcher and $85,000 in gold disappeared, literally, like vapor, as if he had been erased from reality. The police arrived at the bank at 9:41. They found 4 tied-up employees, traumatized but unharmed, the vault open, money and gold missing, but no trace of where the thief had gone. When they found the green pickup truck at Pier 7 at 10:07 in the morning, it was empty, the doors unlocked, the bags gone, and the only evidence that Daniel Fletcher had been there was a nautical map forgotten on the passenger seat, marked with coordinates that led to a point approximately 12 miles offshore. The silence that began at that pier would last 27 years. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. At 10:15 in the morning, the entire police force of Coral Harbor, all 7 officers, was mobilized. At 10:30, the FBI had been contacted. By noon, Coast Guard helicopters were flying over the entire central Florida coast. FBI Special Agent William Dressler arrived from Miami at 2 in the afternoon. A methodical man of 43 years with 15 years of experience in bank crimes, Dressler established a temporary operations command at the Coral Harbor Police Station. His first action was to interrogate every witness, every person who had seen Daniel that morning. Margaret Fletcher was preparing lunch when 2 detectives knocked on her door at 11:45. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. "There must be a mistake," she repeated 17 times during the initial interrogation. "Daniel went to the bank for a meeting about a loan. He'll be home any moment." But as the hours passed and the evidence accumulated, reality began to break through Margaret's denial like ice cracking under pressure. The gray suit she had never seen. The pickup truck registered under a false name. The fact that there was no loan meeting scheduled. The discovery, during a search of the house, of that office, filled with nautical maps and tide tables. Sarah, 12 years old, and Rebecca, 9 years old, didn't fully comprehend what was happening. They only knew that their father hadn't come home, and that serious men with badges were asking questions that made their mother cry. The police's initial theory was simple. Daniel had a boat waiting at Pier 7. He transferred the gold, sailed into open water, and planned to disembark somewhere along the coast, far from Coral Harbor, where a new identity and a new life awaited him. But there were massive problems with this theory. First, no boat had been reported missing from any port between Key West and Jacksonville. The Coast Guard checked every record. Second, tide records showed that at 9:43 in the morning on the 17th of March, the current was flowing moderately, but outgoing navigation was still perfectly possible for someone experienced. Third, multiple witnesses at the port that morning swore they saw no boat leaving Pier 7. But then a dock worker named Eddie Chen mentioned something during his interrogation on the second day. "Now that I think about it," he said, "there was a small aluminum boat tied up there on Thursday. One of those 16-footers, Mercury outboard motor. I'd never seen it before, but Friday morning, when I passed by at 10:30, it was gone." The investigation into this boat would reveal something disturbing. Records in Jacksonville showed that a 16-foot aluminum fishing boat, 25-horsepower Mercury motor, had been purchased for cash 6 months earlier by a man named Robert Mills. The seller remembered the buyer as quiet, new boats, paid cash, and left. The description matched Daniel Fletcher. "It's as if he simply sank into the ocean with all that gold," Agent Dressler commented during a press conference on the third day of investigation. He had no idea how prophetically correct he was. The search intensified. Police divers explored the waters around Pier 7. Nothing. Tracking dogs were brought in to track any scent. They reached the pier and stopped, confused, circling the water's edge as if the trail simply ended there. Every residence within a 15-mile radius was checked. Every cave, every abandoned barn, every empty property was searched. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the initial investigation was what they discovered about Daniel himself. Or rather, what they didn't discover. George Hartman, his co-worker, was interrogated for 5 hours. "I worked with Dan for 8 years, he said, voice tired. "I thought I knew him. But now I realize he never talked about himself. Never. He listened, he observed, but he never shared anything real." Bank employees would later remember seeing Daniel on the premises several times over the years, but always assumed he was there for normal transactions. One employee, Thomas Reed, mentioned something that made Agent Dressler's blood run cold. "He used to stand near the vault, just staring, like he was memorizing everything. But he always smiled and said he was waiting for his turn at the teller, so it never seemed strange. The investigation also uncovered those secret diving courses. The retired Navy instructor in Fort Pierce, Carl Whitman, confirmed that he had given private lessons to a man who identified himself as David Fisher for 18 months. He was dedicated, Whitman said. He practiced constantly, especially deep dives, weight loading, underwater navigation. I thought he was preparing for salvage work or something like that. I never imagined. The forensic examination revealed that Daniel had meticulously prepared every aspect of the robbery. The ropes were of a type rarely sold in commercial stores. The adhesive tape had been cut into specific lengths in advance. The weapon had had its serial number removed with professional precision, and that nautical map found in the pickup truck showed complex ocean routes, current, patterns, and coordinates that seemed to lead to a point 12 miles offshore. But when the Coast Guard sent a vessel to those exact coordinates 2 days after the robbery, they found only open ocean, depth varying between 100 and 140 feet. No sign of wreckage, no sunken boat, nothing. The Coral Harbor community was divided. Some saw Daniel as a brilliant criminal who had fooled them all. Others felt a deep betrayal, as if a trusted member of their family had ripped off a mask and revealed a stranger underneath. Most simply couldn't reconcile the quiet, hard-working Daniel Fletcher they knew with the methodically calculating bank robber who had stolen a fortune in gold. Margaret became a kind of pariah. Neighbors who once smiled and waved now crossed the street to avoid her. Sarah and Rebecca were teased at school. "Daughters of the thief," the other children chanted. The family had to move 3 times in 2 years, trying to escape the notoriety. And, through all of this, one question haunted every investigator, every journalist, every person following the case. Where was Daniel Fletcher? In August of 1961, 5 months after the robbery, the reward for information leading to Daniel's capture and recovery of the gold had reached $50,000. Bounty hunters from across the country descended upon Florida. Every alleged sighting was investigated. A man in New Orleans, who vaguely resembled Daniel, was detained and interrogated for 3 days before his identity was confirmed. An anonymous tip led police to a warehouse in Atlanta, where they found only old fishing equipment. Agent Dressler didn't give up. He was transferred to other cases, but Daniel Fletcher became his personal obsession. Over the next 27 years, even after retiring from the FBI in 1979, Dressler would continue re-examining every piece of evidence, chasing every new lead, unable to accept that a small-town mechanic had executed the perfect crime. And at the center of all this was Margaret Fletcher, who never legally divorced Daniel, never declared him dead, and kept a candle lit in her window every night until the day she died in 1985, 3 years before the final discovery. "He wasn't a monster," she insisted to anyone who would listen. "There was something I didn't see, something he was planning, but he wasn't a monster. And someday, I'll know why." The years transformed Daniel. Fletcher's disappearance from urgent news into local legend, then into a footnote, and finally into a story that old fishermen told in dark bars, each version slightly more embellished than the last. But for those intimately connected to the case, time didn't bring forgetting. It only changed the nature of the pain. Sarah Fletcher, the older daughter, grew up carrying the surname like a scar. She moved north, to Boston. As soon as she turned 18 in 1967, legally changed her name to Sarah Dawson, her mother's maiden name, and cut off almost all contact with her old life. In rare interviews, years later, she described growing up as living in a world where everyone knew a secret about you, but you yourself didn't know all of it. Rebecca, the younger one, reacted differently. She became obsessed with trying to understand who her father really was. During her teenage years, she scoured that office filled with maps, trying to decipher what Daniel had been planning. She learned navigation, studied ocean currents, interviewed elderly fishermen about tide patterns from 1961. "If I can understand how his mind worked," she told a therapist in 1973, "maybe I can understand if there's something of him in me." The prevailing theory that emerged over the years among professional and amateur investigators was that Daniel had died somewhere at sea, that his meticulously planned escape had encountered some unforeseen event, some variable that not even his calculating mind had anticipated, and that he and the gold were resting at the bottom of the ocean somewhere that no one had searched. But where? In 1968, a commercial fisherman named Roy Hendricks claimed to have found a small gold bar caught in his net about 8 miles from the coast. The bar was tested and was authentic, dating from the 1950s, weighing approximately half a kilogram, consistent with the stolen gold. But it was only one bar. No, others were found, despite extensive searches in the area. How a single bar got there remained unexplained. Some speculated that Daniel had thrown part of the treasure overboard when he realized he was in trouble. In 1975, a new theory gained traction. A retired former CIA agent named Thomas Brennan published a book claiming that Daniel Fletcher had been secretly recruited by the CIA during his Navy days, that the bank robbery had been a covert operation to finance anti-communist activities in Latin America, and that Daniel was living under a new identity somewhere in South America. The theory was sensational and absolutely unproven, but it sold many copies and revived public interest in the case. Margaret Fletcher, reading the book in her small house in Tampa, where she had moved to escape the attention, simply shook her head. Daniel wasn't interested in politics, she told a local reporter. He was interested in mechanics and the ocean. That book is fantasy. The FBI officially closed the case in 1980, classifying it as inactive pending new evidence. Agent Dressler, now retired for a year, received the news at his home in Virginia. He was 62 years old, his hair completely white, and Daniel Fletcher still haunted his dreams. "He's out there somewhere," Dressler told his wife that night, "or his body is, and someday someone's going to stumble upon him by accident, because he didn't evaporate. Men don't evaporate." The DTE technological changes of the 1980s brought new search methods, more advanced sonar, better diving techniques. Groups of adventurers would occasionally try to search for the lost treasure, treating it like a modern pirate treasure hunt. A television documentary in 1983 followed one such expedition. They found nothing but sand and wreckage from unrelated shipwrecks. The Coral Harbor community had changed too. The population had grown to 35,000 inhabitants. The First National Bank had been renovated twice and finally demolished in 1979, replaced by a parking lot. New residents knew Daniel Fletcher's story only as local folklore, if they knew it at all. The veterans who remembered that day in March 1961 were now elderly, their memories fading, the intensity of that morning being slowly eroded by time. But then, on the 12th of June, 1988, a perfect and sunny Sunday, everything changed. An amateur diver named Kevin Price, 29 years old, diving instructor from Fort Lauderdale, was exploring a popular reef area approximately 13 miles off the coast of Coral Harbor. Kevin had dived in that specific area perhaps a dozen times before. It was a favorite spot for underwater photography, with vibrant coral formations and abundant marine life. But that Sunday, Kevin decided to explore a little deeper, descending beyond the main reef to a rugged rocky area at 119 feet of depth, almost the safety limit for recreational diving. And there, partially covered by sand and encrusted with 27 years of marine growth, nestled between rock formations that created a kind of small natural cave, Kevin Price saw something he initially thought was just an unusual coral formation. But then he got closer, and what he saw made every drop of blood in his body turn to ice. Kevin emerged from the water in a state of functional shock. He managed to get on the boat, managed to begin proper decompression, but his mind was spinning, unable to fully process what he had seen in the dark depths below. A human skeleton, lying on the rocky ocean floor, partially protected by a natural formation that explained why it had remained intact for so long, and scattered around it, partially buried in sand but still partially visible, the unmistakable gleam of golden metal. "I knew immediately what it was," Kevin would report later. "Anyone who grew up in Florida knows the story of the missing bank robber." And there he was, exactly where he had been for the last 27 years, with his stolen treasure still around him, like some kind of dead guardian protecting something he could never use again. Kevin reported his discovery to the Coast Guard immediately upon returning to port. At 5:30 in the afternoon on the 12th of June, a forensic diving team was being assembled. At 9 in the morning on Monday, the 13th of June, 6 Bs. Specialized divers descended to that location 119 feet below the surface. What they found was simultaneously an answer to a 27-year mystery and the beginning of a box of even more puzzling questions. The skeleton was in a partially curved position, the right arm extended over what appeared to have been a bag or sack, now disintegrated by salt water and time. The bones were relatively well preserved due to the depth, cold water temperature, and the protection offered by the rock formation. Fragments of clothing, mainly pieces of synthetic material that had resisted decomposition better than natural fabrics, still clung to parts of the skeleton. A diving weight belt was still around the waist region of the skeleton, explaining why the body had never floated to the surface. And the gold. 5 bars, exactly as Daniel had taken from the bank. Approximately 43 rare coins, scattered in a 4-meter radius around the body, some in rock crevices, others partially buried in sand, as if they had been carefully placed one at a time. About 15 meters from the main body, the divers found corroded metal fragments that appeared to be remains of old diving equipment. Pieces of a tank, parts of a regulator, so deteriorated after 27 years of immersion that they were almost unrecognizable. But they were there, finally answering the question of how Daniel had descended to that depth. Formal identification would take weeks, but investigators already knew whose remains they had found. The height of the skeleton was consistent with Daniel Fletcher's records. Later dental analysis would positively confirm the identity. And that small crescent-shaped scar, the damage to the bones of the left eyebrow, was visible even after 27 years submerged. But how did Daniel Fletcher get there? And why was he surrounded by gold that clearly had never been moved since his death? The forensic analysis began to piece together the story piece by piece. First, it was determined that the skeleton showed no signs of violent trauma, no skull fractures, no obvious damage to ribs or long bones. This ruled out violent homicide or a catastrophic fall. Second, The analysis of marine growth on the bones and gold suggested they had been in that exact location for decades, unmoved, undisturbed, except by natural sedimentation processes. This was consistent with the body having arrived there on or near March of 1961, and remained since then. Third, and perhaps most revealing, the position of the body and the distribution of the gold told a specific story. The skeleton was curved over one of the bags, one arm still extended as if trying to protect it or reach for it. The bars and coins were arranged in a pattern that suggested they had been carefully placed, not randomly thrown. Some were in deep crevices in the rocks, as if Daniel had been deliberately hiding them. Dr. Patricia Henning, the leading forensic pathologist on the investigation, offered her interpretation. This man arrived at this location alive. He was deliberately placing the gold in various hiding spots in the rock formations, creating multiple points of concealment. And then something went catastrophically wrong. Something prevented him from returning to the surface. But what? The most plausible theory involved a combination of factors. Daniel had descended to 119 feet with 1961 diving equipment, which was primitive by modern standards. He was carrying heavy weight. He was working under extreme physical and psychological pressure, placing gold bars in hiding spots while monitoring his air supply. The evidence from the equipment fragments suggested possible malfunction. Perhaps the regulator failed. Perhaps the tank developed a leak. Or perhaps, more simply, Daniel lost track of time in the depths and ran out of air before finishing his task. At that depth, with 1961 equipment, he would have perhaps 20 to 25 minutes of air at most. Not much time to anchor a boat, descend with heavy weight, and meticulously hide gold bars in multiple locations. There was also the possibility of nitrogen narcosis, the so-called rapture of the deep, which begins to affect judgment at depths below 100 feet. Daniel, despite his training, may have had his judgment compromised, making fatal errors. Diving medicine professor Mark Wilson from Duke University offered a technical analysis. In 1961, diving to 119 feet was possible but extremely risky. The equipment was heavy, clumsy, prone to failures. Add the stress of carrying extra weight, working against the clock, and being in a high adrenaline mental state after committing a crime. It's a recipe for disaster. If anything went wrong, and in diving, things can always go wrong, he would have had very little margin of error to recover. And there was a final discovery that painted an even more somber picture. Analysis of the skeleton's positioning and the conditions of the surrounding rocks suggested that Daniel may have become partially trapped. His extended arm, the angle of the body, the proximity of the rock formations. It's possible that, while trying to place a gold bar in a deep crevice, he became trapped or disoriented in the labyrinthine rock formation, unable to free himself before his air ran out. One investigator described it as a perfect trap. Daniel had chosen that location precisely because the rock formations offered excellent hiding places. But those same formations made the area dangerous to navigate under pressure and with limited visibility. William Dressler, the former FBI agent, now 70 years old, was contacted immediately after the discovery. He flew to Florida from his home in Virginia. When shown the underwater photos of the skeleton surrounded by gold, tears actually filled his eyes. "I knew he was out there," Dressler said in a quiet voice. "I always knew. The ocean took him, but Daniel knew it could take him. He planned everything, except one thing." "What?" asked a reporter. Dressler looked at the dark waters of the Atlantic. "He planned how to get the gold. planned how to hide it where no one would find it. But he underestimated the ocean itself. No human plan, no matter how meticulous, can predict all the variables when you're 120 feet underwater with your life, depending on equipment that can fail at any moment. The final revelations brought more questions than answers, as the best mysteries always do. Rebecca Fletcher, now Rebecca Dawson, married with 2 children of her own, traveled to Florida when she heard about the discovery. She was 36 years old, a high school teacher in Seattle, and hadn't seen the Florida coast since 1975. She stood on the beach, looking at the horizon, knowing that her father had been under that water her entire life. He was planning to come back, she told an interviewer a few days later. That's what I finally understand. Everyone assumed he was planning to take the gold and flee, start a new life somewhere far away. But that wasn't it. He was planning to hide the gold where no one would ever find it, in multiple underwater hiding spots. And then return home. Return to my mother, to me and Sarah, and live as if nothing had happened. And maybe, years later, when the investigation had cooled completely, recover it little by little, bar by bar. It was a theory that made terrible and tragic sense. It explained why Daniel had chosen such a remote and deep location. It explained why he had placed the gold so carefully in separate rock crevices, creating multiple recovery points. It explained why he had secretly bought the boat but hadn't made arrangements to leave Florida permanently. There was no plane ticket purchased, no new identity established in another state, no money transferred to foreign accounts. Daniel Fletcher wasn't planning to disappear. He was planning the perfect crime where he would remain in plain sight, innocent, while police searched for a phantom fugitive. But then, the ocean had other plans. Later analysis of the small aluminum boat that Daniel had purchased revealed another disturbing detail. Vessels of that type and size were extremely vulnerable to ocean conditions. Weather records from the 17th of March, 1961, showed that while the morning had begun calm, the wind had increased significantly around 11 o'clock, creating 3 to 5 foot waves. Not enough to sink a boat, but enough to make it unstable. The emerging theory was that Daniel had anchored the boat above the dive site, descended with the gold, and was working to hide it when something went wrong underwater. When he failed to return, the anchored boat eventually came loose in the growing waves and drifted, eventually sinking somewhere or being carried so far that it was never connected to the case. This explained why no boat was found in the vicinity of the body. The recovered gold, valued at approximately $68,000 in 1988, value due to gold's appreciation over the decades, was returned to the legal heirs of the insurance company that had covered the original loss in 1961. This represented the 5 bars and 43 coins found with the body. The remainder of the original stolen quantity, several other valuable coins, was never recovered and presumably was dispersed over the years or remains hidden in other crevices in that complex rocky area that divers didn't fully explore. Daniel Fletcher's case was officially closed in October of 1988. The cause of death was listed as accidental drowning during criminal activity. No posthumous charges were filed. There was no one to prosecute. Just a skeleton that had been a man, a husband, a father, a war veteran, and, for 42 minutes in March of 1961, the most audacious bank robber in Florida history. Margaret Fletcher, who had died 3 years earlier in 1985, never knew that her husband had been found. She died still believing that someday she would understand why. Sarah, living in Boston under her changed name, refused public comment when contacted. Rebecca briefly stayed with the remains, now nothing more than cleaned and sanitized bones, in an urn, and then buried them in St. Michael's Cemetery in Tampa, next to the grave that Margaret had kept for Daniel for 24 years, waiting for a body that never arrived in her lifetime. The headstone reads simply, Daniel Raymond Fletcher, 1923 to 1961. Lost at sea. Now found. William Dressler visited the grave once, in the winter of 1989. He was 71 years old now, his decades-long obsession finally resolved, though not in the way he expected. He stood there for exactly 42 minutes, the same amount of time Daniel had spent robbing the bank, and then left without saying a word. But there are elements of this case that were never fully explained, loose threads that continue to bother investigators and mystery enthusiasts to this day. First, why did Daniel choose that exact specific location? The coordinates on the map didn't match perfectly with the location where the body was found. They were about 1.5 miles to the northeast. Does this suggest that Daniel had planned multiple hiding locations? Was he creating a network of underwater vaults? Was the location where he was found his first stop, or his last? Second, that gold bar found in 1968 by fisherman Roy Hendricks, 8 miles away. Was it really part of Daniel's gold, or a bizarre coincidence? If it was his, how did it get so far from the body? Had Daniel dropped it while navigating? Did he have undiscovered partners who recovered part of the gold? Third, the boat. Despite extensive searches over the years, the 16-foot aluminum boat registered to Robert Mills was never definitively located. Where is it? Did it sink nearby and was never identified among the many wrecks on the ocean floor? Did it drift hundreds of miles before sinking? And finally, did Daniel tell anyone? Did he have a confidant? An accomplice who decided never to come forward? The perfection of his planning suggests years of meticulous preparation. Is it possible that someone knew something but never spoke, taking their own secrets to the grave? These questions will probably never be answered. Like so many great mysteries, the solution to one central question only revealed deeper layers of unknowns beneath. But perhaps it's appropriate that some elements remain unexplained. Because Daniel Raymond Fletcher, the quiet mechanic who fooled everyone, who planned one of the most elaborate robberies in American history, who descended into the dark depths with stolen treasure and never returned, still keeps some secrets. The ocean guarded those secrets for 27 years. And even now, with the body recovered, with the story largely reconstructed, the Atlantic still holds mysteries that no one can reach. Somewhere down there, in the cold darkness beyond where sunlight penetrates, perhaps more gold coins still rest in rock crevices that no diver has found. Perhaps the remains of the small aluminum boat are lying in an underwater valley, covered by decades of sediment. Perhaps there are other hiding locations that Daniel was planning to use, marked on maps that were lost when he died. We'll never know for certain. And perhaps that's the most appropriate thing about this case. Daniel Fletcher planned to keep a secret. He planned to hide something where no one would ever find it. And even in death, even with his body recovered and his identity confirmed, he partially succeeded. Part of his plan, part of his story, will remain buried in the dark depths, perhaps forever. The next time you're looking at the ocean, consider this. How many other secrets are down there? How many other stories are waiting decades or centuries to be told? How many other impossible mysteries are resting silently at the bottom of the sea, guarded by pressure and darkness? Daniel Raymond Fletcher joins the ranks of the great enigmas of history. Not because we don't know what happened to him, but because even knowing, we still don't fully understand. Was he a brilliant criminal whose plan almost worked perfectly? Or a man who overestimated his own abilities and underestimated the forces of nature? Did he intend to create multiple hiding spots and recover the treasure over years? Or was that his only location, and he simply had bad luck? These are questions that no forensic evidence can answer definitively. And so Daniel Fletcher remains, even now, decades after his death, a figure wrapped in layers of mystery. The thief who vanished. The man who planned the impossible. The father and husband who took secrets to the bottom of the ocean and kept them there for 27 years. The war veteran who used his technical skills not to serve, but to steal. The quiet neighbor that no one really knew. His grave in Tampa is occasionally visited by those fascinated by unsolved mysteries, by people who wonder what leads someone to risk everything, to throw everything away, for golden metal that in the end meant nothing, and 13 miles off the coast of Coral Harbor, at 119 feet below the surface, the location where Daniel died remains. Kevin Price, the diver who found him, visited once more in 1992, but said he would never return. "There's something about that place," he said. "Even with the body removed, with the gold recovered, you can feel something in the rocks, in the way the water moves, like the place itself witnessed something that shouldn't have happened." Is the mystery solved? Do we know what happened to Daniel Raymond Fletcher? We know the facts. We know where he went, what he did, where he died. But truth and facts don't always tell the complete story. And sometimes the most fascinating mysteries are those where we know the ending but still don't fully understand the journey. Daniel Fletcher robbed a bank. Daniel Fletcher sailed to sea. Daniel Fletcher dove to dangerous depths with stolen gold. Daniel Fletcher died down there, surrounded by the treasure he thought he could hide and recover. These are the facts. But what was going through his mind in those last moments when he realized something was wrong, that he wouldn't return to the surface, that he would never see Margaret, Sarah, and Rebecca again? Did he feel remorse, terror, or simply the cold acceptance that he had miscalculated a crucial variable? These answers died with him, in the silent depths where no voice can reach, where only water pressure and eternal darkness witnessed his final moments. And perhaps, in the end, that's what makes this case eternally fascinating. Not the crime itself, not the disappearance, but the eternal silence of the ocean, guarding secrets that not even death can fully reveal. Human ambition confronting indifferent natural forces. The perfect plan destroyed by variables impossible to control. Daniel Raymond Fletcher's case is closed in official records, but in the minds of those who study the limits of human ambition, who wonder about the price of secrecy, who look at the waves and imagine what lies below, the case will always remain partially open, because some mysteries aren't meant to be completely solved. Some secrets are kept by the depths, and some stories, no matter how many facts we can gather, will remain forever just beyond our complete grasp. Like Daniel Fletcher himself, resting for 27 years on the ocean floor, invisible but present, known but inexplicable, found but with secrets still guarded in depths that no one has fully explored. The ocean still keeps its mysteries, and Daniel Fletcher became part of them.